Farming was the foundation of life in the Middle Ages. Almost everything in society depended on the work done in the fields. Kings, nobles, knights, priests, and townspeople could not survive without the steady labor of the farming population. The majority of people in medieval Europe were farmers, and their daily routines shaped the rhythm of life for the entire community. The land itself was divided and controlled through the feudal system. This meant that lords and nobles owned large estates, and peasants were expected to work the land in exchange for protection and the right to live on it. Many of these peasants were serfs. A serf was not a slave, but they were not free either. They could not leave the manor without permission, and they owed the lord both labor and a portion of their harvest. Even free peasants, who technically had more rights, still owed heavy taxes, rents, and duties that tied them closely to the land. The work of these farmers provided food not only for their families but for entire manors, villages, and even towns. Grain was ground into flour for bread, which was the staple food for nearly everyone. Surplus crops could be sold at markets, but for most farmers, survival was the priority. Their harvests determined whether their families and neighbors would have enough to eat through the winter. A bad season could mean hunger, disease, or even famine. Farmers also supported the church. Every peasant was expected to give a tithe, which was usually 1/10 of their crops, to the local parish. This was in addition to what they already owed to their lord. In return, the church provided spiritual guidance and promised blessings for good harvests, though in reality, peasants had little choice but to pay. Medieval farming was not just an individual effort, but a community responsibility. Villages were built around shared fields, common grazing lands, and collective tasks. Everyone had to contribute to plowing, planting, and harvesting. Cooperation was necessary because the scale of the work was too great for a single household to handle alone. For the medieval farmer, the year was organized around the agricultural cycle. The arrival of spring meant long days of plowing and sowing. Summer required constant attention to growing crops. Autumn brought the harvest, the busiest and most important time of year, when every able body was needed in the fields. Winter was quieter in terms of fieldwork, but filled with repairs, animal care, and the daily struggle to endure the cold months with whatever food had been stored. Life as a medieval farmer was demanding. Work began at sunrise and continued until sunset, in all weather and in every season. Most farmers lived in simple one-room cottages with little comfort, often shared with their animals for warmth. Illness, injury, and hunger were constant threats, yet the survival of the entire medieval world rested on their shoulders. In this way, farming was not just an occupation. It was the backbone of medieval society. Every castle, cathedral, and market town existed only because peasants toiled day after day, year after year, to work the land. Their labor fed armies, sustained rulers, and supported the growth of civilization during the Middle Ages. For medieval farmers, the year was not measured by weeks or months in the way we think of time today. Instead, it was measured by the rhythm of the agricultural cycle. The land dictated the schedule, and the seasons shaped every aspect of life. Survival depended on knowing what tasks had to be done, and when. The entire community was tied to this cycle, and falling behind could mean disaster. In the spring, when the frost began to soften and the ground was no longer frozen, farmers prepared for the most important work of the year, plowing and sowing. Heavy wooden plows were pulled across the soil by teams of oxen, or in some cases, horses. Oxen were slower but stronger and more reliable, especially for the heavy clay soils of northern Europe. Horses worked faster, but they required better harnesses, more expensive care, and more food. Not every farmer could afford them. The work was exhausting, not just for the animals but for the peasants who guided the plows through uneven, rocky, or muddy ground. Once the fields were plowed, seeds were carefully sown by hand. Wheat and barley were the most valuable crops, while oats, rye, beans, and peas were also planted. Men often scattered the seeds across the soil, while women and children followed behind, lightly covering them with soil using rakes or their feet. The timing of this work mattered greatly. If the seeds were sown too early, they risked being destroyed by late frost. If sown too late, the harvest might not be ready before the cold set in again. There was no room for mistakes. As spring gave way to summer, the focus shifted from planting to maintaining. Fields needed constant care. Weeds had to be pulled, hedges repaired, and pests driven away. Birds could eat valuable seeds, while insects and small animals could damage crops. Children were often tasked with scaring crows and other birds by shouting, clapping, or shaking simple wooden rattles. It may seem like a small job, but in a world where every grain counted, it was essential. Summer also brought work with animals. Livestock had to be watched carefully, grazed on common pastures, and protected from illness or theft. Cows provided milk, which was turned into butter and cheese. Sheep provided wool, one of the most important resources in medieval Europe. Pigs were allowed to roam in forests, feeding on acorns and roots, until they were fat enough to be slaughtered in the autumn. All of this work fell on the shoulders of the peasant families, who balanced fieldwork with tending animals every single day. By late summer and early autumn, the most important season of the year arrived, the harvest. This was the make or break moment in the life of a medieval village. Harvesting began with cutting the grain, usually wheat or barley, using simple hand tools like sickles and scythes. Whole families, along with neighbors and hired laborers, worked side by side from dawn until dusk. The work was urgent. Grain had to be gathered before bad weather ruined it. A sudden storm or early frost could wipe out months of labor. Once cut, the grain was bundled into sheaves and left to dry in the fields before being taken to barns or storage pits. Some was set aside to pay taxes or tithes. Some was stored for seed for the next year. The rest would be ground into flour for bread, the essential food of the medieval diet. For peasants, there was rarely much left over. Most families lived harvest to harvest, with little security. A poor yield could mean hunger, and repeated failures could mean famine for the entire region. The harvest season was also a time when the obligations of peasants became most visible. Lords expected rents and dues to be paid, often in the form of grain, hay, or livestock. The church collected its tithe. Some peasants also had to work on the Lord's land for free during harvest, a duty known as labor service. This could mean long days spent gathering crops that would not even feed their own families. Despite this burden, the harvest was still a season of intense activity and community effort. Everyone, from children to the elderly, contributed in some way. When the harvest was complete, the focus shifted to preparing for the long months of winter. Fields were cleared, tools repaired, and animals sheltered. The autumn was also the season of slaughter. Animals that could not be fed through the winter, such as pigs, were killed and preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. This meat was essential for surviving the cold months when fresh food was scarce. The work of autumn was heavy, but it brought a sense of completion. A successful harvest meant relief and hope that there would be enough to last until the next spring. Winter, while quieter in the fields, was by no means a season of rest. The daily care of animals continued, and peasants worked on repairing cottages, fences, and equipment. Spinning wool, weaving cloth, and making simple household items also took place during the dark months. Food supplies were carefully rationed, and families often faced hunger before the next harvest. Disease was common in winter, when poor nutrition and cold conditions weakened the body. For many peasants, survival through winter was the hardest challenge of all. The farming year, with its unending cycle of labor, dictated the lives of medieval farmers. Every season brought new tasks, new worries, and new hopes. Unlike the lives of nobles or townsfolk, who could look forward to feasts, trade, or military campaigns, peasants lived in rhythm with the soil. Their lives were shaped by plowing, planting, harvesting, and enduring the long winters. It was a cycle that repeated year after year, generation after generation, and it was the foundation on which all of medieval society rested. The everyday life of a medieval farmer was defined by work, and that work depended on tools that were simple, reliable, and built to last. Unlike the advanced machines we know today, medieval farming relied on basic equipment, often made of wood, iron, or whatever material could be found locally. A farmer's tools were an extension of their own hands, and without them, even the most fertile field could not be worked. One of the most important tools was the plow. In areas with lighter soil, a simple scratch plow was used. This was essentially a wooden frame with an iron tip that scratched the surface of the earth, enough to prepare it for sowing seeds. But in regions with heavy clay-rich soil, such as northern Europe, a heavier plow was necessary. This heavy plow, often fitted with a large iron blade, cut deeper into the ground and turned the soil over. It was harder to pull, requiring strong oxen or horses, but it made farming possible in areas that otherwise would not have been productive. The introduction of this heavy plow during the medieval period greatly expanded the amount of land that could be farmed. Oxen were the most common draft animals. They were slow but steady, and they could pull a plow for long hours without tiring easily. Horses, when harnessed properly, were faster, but they required better feed such as oats, which meant devoting more land to growing food for them. This was a trade-off that many peasants could not afford. For wealthier manors, however, horses became increasingly valuable, especially as harness technology improved. Once the soil was prepared and seeds were planted, other tools came into play. Hoes, spades, and rakes were used for weeding, planting, and breaking up clumps of soil. These were usually made of wood with iron tips or edges. Farmers could repair them themselves, but iron parts had to be purchased or supplied by the blacksmith, which added another cost to the already heavy burden peasants carried. Harvesting brought another set of tools. The sickle was one of the oldest and most widely used. It had a short, curved blade and was designed to be held in one hand, cutting stalks of grain close to the ground. It required patience and repetition, as only a small handful could be cut at a time. The scythe, a longer tool with a curved blade attached to a long wooden shaft, allowed workers to cut larger sections of grain more quickly. However, it required more skill and strength to use effectively. Both tools were dangerous when handled carelessly. Accidents were not uncommon, and in a world without hospitals, even small injuries could be life-threatening. Carrying and transporting the harvest was another essential task. Farmers used simple wooden carts with solid wheels, pulled by animals or, in poorer households, by people themselves. These carts carried not only harvested grain but also hay, manure, firewood, and anything else too heavy to transport by hand. Ropes, baskets, and sacks made from hemp or wool were also part of everyday farming life. In addition to crop farming, the care of animals required its own set of tools. Farmers needed buckets for water and milk, knives for slaughtering or shearing, and simple shelters for keeping animals safe. Sheep were sheared with iron shears, providing wool for clothing and trade. Cows were milked by hand into wooden pails, and pigs were fattened with scraps and allowed to forage until the time came to butcher them. Every tool, every bucket, and every rope was used until it broke, and even then, it was often repaired rather than replaced. It is important to remember that these tools were not just objects, but part of the rhythm of life. A farmer might spend hours sharpening a blade, mending a handle, or tightening the harness on an ox. These small acts of maintenance were as important as the work in the fields. A broken plow or a dull sickle at the wrong time could mean losing valuable days of labor, which could in turn affect the harvest. Tools were also a marker of wealth and status within a village. A family with good iron tools, a sturdy plow, and strong animals was better equipped to survive hard years than one that had to borrow or rent equipment. Sometimes, poorer peasants were forced to share tools or work together with neighbors, which created both cooperation and tension. In some cases, lords provided tools for their peasants, but this often came with strings attached, such as higher rents or more labor obligations. Daily work with these tools began at sunrise and ended at sunset. There was no weekend or holiday from the demands of the land, except for church feast days, which were the few times when peasants could rest. Even then, the work of tending animals continued, for cows still needed to be milked, and sheep still needed to be watched. The tools of farming never stayed idle for long. The simplicity of these tools might suggest an easy life, but in truth, it was the opposite. Every stroke of the hoe, every pull of the plow, and every swing of the sickle represented hours of physical labor. It was a life of endurance, where survival depended on the steady, repetitive use of these basic instruments. Though they were plain, these tools shaped the lives of millions of people and sustained medieval society for centuries. The work of medieval farmers was centered on two things: the crops they grew in the fields and the animals they raised in the barns, sheds, and pastures. Both were essential for survival, and together they provided the basic building blocks of medieval life. Without them, there would be no food, no clothing, and no trade. The balance between crops and animals shaped the routine of every peasant household. Crops were the foundation of the medieval diet. Above all, grain was the most important. Wheat was the preferred grain because it made the best bread, but it was also the most difficult to grow, requiring good soil and favorable weather. Barley was more common, used for making both bread and ale, which was safer to drink than water in many cases. Rye was hardy and could grow in poorer soils, making it a staple in many regions. Oats were used both for making coarse bread and for feeding animals, especially horses. In addition to these grains, peasants grew beans, peas, and lentils. These legumes were important because they added variety to the diet and could be stored for long periods without spoiling. Vegetables also played a role, though they were less central than grains. Cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips were grown in small garden plots near cottages. These kitchen gardens were often tended by women and children, who kept them weeded and watered. Herbs such as parsley, sage, and dill were used for flavoring food, though meals remained plain by modern standards. Fruit was less common but still valued when available. Apples, pears, plums, and cherries grew in orchards, while berries could be gathered from hedgerows and woods. However, fresh fruit was seasonal and could not always be stored for long. The cycle of crop growing followed the same rhythm each year. Seeds were planted in spring, cared for in summer, harvested in autumn, and stored in barns or pits for the winter. Some of the harvest was kept for seed for the next year, while the rest was divided between feeding the family, paying rents and tithes, and, if anything was left over, selling at local markets. For many peasants, there was rarely a surplus. They grew just enough to survive, with little room for error. A bad harvest due to drought, flood, or disease could mean hunger not just for one family, but for an entire village. Animals were just as vital as crops, and almost every peasant household kept some. Cows were valuable for their milk, which could be drunk fresh or turned into butter and cheese. Cheese, in particular, was an important food because it lasted longer and provided protein that bread alone could not. Oxen, while also cattle, were mainly used for pulling plows and carts. They were slower than horses, but more dependable and easier to feed. Sheep were kept for both wool and meat. Wool was one of the most important products in medieval Europe, traded across long distances and forming the basis of entire economies, especially in regions like England and Flanders. Peasant families might spin wool at home, turning it into yarn for clothing and blankets, while larger flocks were sheared and sold to merchants. Sheep also provided milk, though this was less common than cow's milk. Pigs were among the most useful animals because they could eat almost anything. They foraged in woods and fields, eating acorns, roots, and scraps. This made them inexpensive to raise, and their meat could be preserved through salting or smoking, lasting through the winter. Chickens were common as well, providing eggs and occasional meat. Geese and ducks added variety and were sometimes driven in flocks to markets for sale. Every animal had a purpose beyond food. Horses, though less common for peasants, were used for plowing and transport where possible. Dogs were kept for guarding and herding. Cats were useful for keeping down mice and rats, which threatened precious stores of grain. Even manure from animals was valuable, spread across fields to fertilize the soil and improve future harvests. Nothing went to waste in the careful balance of medieval farming. The care of animals required constant attention. They had to be fed, watered, and sheltered, especially in the harsh winters. Diseases could spread quickly through herds, threatening a family's livelihood. Theft was another concern, since animals were highly valuable, and villages sometimes organized night watches to protect common pastures. Crops and animals were not separate parts of medieval farming, but interconnected. Grain fed both humans and animals. Animals provided manure to fertilize the fields. Wool, milk, meat, and hides supported daily life and allowed some families to trade for items they could not produce themselves. The entire system was fragile but efficient, developed over generations to make the most of limited resources. For medieval farmers, crops and animals were more than just food. They were survival, security, and sometimes the difference between life and death. A good harvest and healthy livestock meant a stable year. A poor harvest or a sickness among animals could mean hunger, hardship, or worse. This delicate balance was the reality of medieval farming, and it shaped every decision, every day of labor, and every hope for the future. The way medieval farmers worked the land was not random. Over time, farming systems developed that shaped how fields were divided, how crops were rotated, and how communities shared responsibility for the land. These systems were simple in design but powerful in their impact. They allowed medieval villages to survive for centuries under the pressures of weather, population growth, and constant obligations to lords and the church. One of the most common arrangements was the open field system. In this system, farmland was not enclosed by hedges or fences, as we often imagine modern farms to be. Instead, large fields were divided into long, narrow strips. Each family was given several strips scattered across different parts of the field. This scattering was not accidental. It ensured that no one family had only poor soil or only the best land. By spreading the strips, the risks of bad soil or flooding were shared among the community. The open fields meant that farmers worked side by side, often shoulder to shoulder with their neighbors. They used the same paths, plowed along the same furrows, and often had to agree on when to plow, plant, and harvest. Individual freedom was limited, but the system created a sense of cooperation and fairness. Disputes did occur, especially when animals wandered across strips or when someone delayed their work, but villages usually had local customs or officials, like a reeve, to settle these issues. Connected to the open field system was the three-field rotation method, which gradually replaced the older two-field system in many regions. In the older two-field system, land was divided into two halves. One was planted while the other was left fallow, or unused, to recover. While this allowed the soil to rest, it also meant that only half of the land produced food at a time. The three-field system improved on this by dividing the land into three parts. In the three-field system, one section was planted with wheat or rye, another with barley, oats, peas, or beans, and the third was left fallow. Each year, the crops rotated, so the land was never exhausted by planting the same thing continuously. This method provided two harvests instead of one, with the third field resting. It increased food production, supported growing populations, and helped reduce the risk of famine. While it required coordination across the village, the benefits were so great that it spread widely during the Middle Ages. Beyond the fields themselves, medieval farmers also relied on common land, or shared areas where animals could graze. This land was not privately owned, but belonged to the entire village community. Cows, sheep, and pigs were often herded together on this shared pasture. Access to common land was vital for poorer peasants, who might not own much land themselves, but could still keep animals to provide milk, wool, or meat. The rules of grazing were usually strict, with limits on how many animals each family could keep to prevent overuse of the land. Farmers also developed techniques to make the most of their resources. Manure spreading was a basic but crucial practice. Animal droppings were collected and spread across the fields to fertilize the soil, restoring nutrients that crops had taken away. Without this, the land would quickly lose its productivity. Some farmers also used crop residues, like straw, to improve soil quality. In wetter areas, drainage ditches were dug to channel excess water away from fields, while in drier regions, farmers used small irrigation methods to guide water toward crops. These were not large-scale projects, but rather local, practical solutions passed down through generations. Each community adjusted its farming practices to the local environment. The methods were not advanced by modern standards, but they worked. Over centuries, these systems of strips, rotation, and common grazing created a stable framework that supported entire villages and manors. Farming techniques were simple, but they reflected a deep understanding of the land. Every decision was based on experience, trial and error, and traditions that stretched back for generations. For medieval farmers, these systems were not optional. They were the rules of survival. A family could not simply decide to plant crops differently from everyone else, because their land was tied to the larger cycle of the community. Cooperation was not just encouraged, it was necessary. The health of the harvest depended on everyone following the same rhythm, using the same systems, and sharing the same burdens. These farming techniques may seem ordinary, but they were the backbone of medieval life. Without them, villages would not have produced enough food, and society as a whole would have struggled to survive. From the layout of the fields to the rotation of crops, every detail mattered. The methods were simple, but they supported millions of people across Europe for centuries, forming the quiet but powerful structure of medieval farming. Medieval farming was never the task of a single person working alone. It was always a collective effort built on cooperation, shared responsibility, and the constant presence of neighbors. A single family could not plow an entire field, harvest acres of grain, or guard livestock by themselves. The demands of the land required many hands, and because of this, the life of the medieval farmer was deeply tied to the life of the village community. The open field system, with its long strips of shared land, meant that everyone's farming schedule had to be coordinated. Villagers could not simply decide to sow seeds or begin harvesting on their own. The timing had to be agreed upon collectively, often by tradition, or by the authority of the village leaders. This avoided conflicts and ensured that the work of one family did not harm the efforts of another. For example, if one farmer plowed his strip at the wrong time, it could damage the shared furrows or disrupt the animals used by others. In this way, farming was not only about personal survival, but about respecting the rhythm of the group. Labor during busy seasons was perhaps the clearest example of community effort. During the harvest, every able person in the village worked side by side. Men cut grain with sickles and scythes, women gathered and tied it into bundles, and children carried sheaves to carts or stacked them for drying. Even the elderly, who could no longer swing tools, contributed by watching over children, tending fires, or helping to prepare food for workers. Harvest was not just a task, it was a community-wide event, and failure by one household could endanger the survival of all. The same sense of cooperation applied to plowing and planting. Guiding a heavy plow through thick soil required more than one person. A team of oxen or horses needed a driver, someone to handle the plow itself, and often an extra pair of hands to clear stones or roots. Neighbors frequently helped each other, knowing that when their turn came, the favor would be returned. This reciprocal labor created bonds of trust, but it also created obligations. A farmer who refused to help his neighbors might find himself without assistance when his own fields needed urgent work. Shared resources also encouraged cooperation. Common pastures, woodlands, and meadows belonged to the whole village rather than to individuals. Cows and sheep grazed together, watched over by village herders. Firewood was gathered from the same forests, and water was drawn from the same wells. Rules were set, often enforced by the reeve or by local custom, to prevent overuse. These commons were essential, especially for poorer peasants who had fewer animals or smaller strips of land. Without access to shared grazing or woodland, many families could not have survived at all. Village roles and organization helped maintain this cooperation. The reeve, usually a peasant elected or appointed by the lord, oversaw the daily running of the manor. He made sure that everyone performed their duties, settled disputes, and organized work on the lord's land. There were also haywards, who guarded meadows from being grazed too early, and herdsmen, who took collective responsibility for animals. Each role reflected the fact that farming was not an individual pursuit, but a shared enterprise requiring coordination and oversight. Festivals and feast days also strengthened community ties. After the harvest, for example, some villages held small celebrations to mark the end of the most demanding work. While food was still limited, sharing bread, ale, and simple dishes gave peasants a moment of rest and reminded them that their survival was a collective achievement. These gatherings were modest, but they provided a sense of unity, which was as important as the physical labor itself. Of course, cooperation did not mean that life was free from conflict. Disagreements over boundaries, grazing rights, or the division of labor were common. A cow straying into a neighbor's field could spark anger. A family accused of withholding labor or failing to contribute to the Lord's work might face fines or punishment. Yet even with these disputes, the structure of the village forced people to find compromise. Isolation was not an option. To live in a medieval farming community was to live tied to others, bound by the land, by obligations, and by necessity. The dependence on community also shaped family life. Children were expected to contribute from a young age, scaring birds from crops, carrying water, or gathering firewood. Women balanced housework with work in the fields, often doing the same hard labor as men during planting and harvest. Elderly family members passed down knowledge, traditions, and stories that guided the younger generations. Every person had a role, and every role fit into the larger fabric of the community. This cooperation extended even to times of hardship. In years of poor harvests, villages might pool resources to help the most vulnerable families survive the winter. Bread was shared, debts were sometimes delayed, and neighbors looked after each other's children if parents fell ill. These acts were not always out of kindness alone. They were also practical. A village could not afford to lose too many members, for every hand was needed when the cycle of farming began again. In the medieval world, survival was not an individual achievement. It was a collective one. Farming systems, shared resources, and the sheer difficulty of agricultural labor made cooperation the backbone of village life. For peasants, the bonds between neighbors were as essential as the bonds between family members. Without cooperation, the fields could not be plowed, the harvest could not be gathered, and the village itself could not endure. Life for a medieval farmer was not only about working the land. Alongside the endless cycle of plowing, planting, and harvesting came a long list of obligations, rents, and duties that made survival even harder. Farmers lived under a system that demanded much from them while giving little in return. Their labor fed everyone else, yet they themselves lived close to the edge of hunger and poverty. The most significant obligation was owed to the lord of the manor. Peasants who worked the land did not own it. Instead, they held it in exchange for service. Many were serfs, tied to the land and unable to leave without permission. A serf was not a slave, but he was not free either. His family's future was bound to the manor, generation after generation. Even peasants who were technically free still owed heavy rents, dues, and services to their lords. One form of duty was labor service. This required peasants to work on the lord's land for part of the week, in addition to their own farming. They plowed the lord's fields, harvested his crops, repaired his fences, and maintained his roads. These tasks were often done at the busiest times of year, which meant peasants had less time to tend to their own survival. Refusing was not an option. The lord had legal authority, and disobedience could result in fines or punishment. Another burden came in the form of rents and payments. Instead of money, these were often paid in kind. A peasant might owe part of his grain harvest, a share of his animals, or even specific products like eggs, wool, or honey. Some payments were symbolic, like giving a chicken at Easter, while others were significant, taking away valuable food that the family needed. As money became more common in the later Middle Ages, many peasants had to pay cash rents, which added the pressure of finding coins in a world where most people rarely handled money. On top of these obligations to their lords, peasants also owed dues to the church. The most common was the tithe, usually 1/10 of a farmer's crops. This was collected by the local parish and used to support priests, churches, and monasteries. For peasants already struggling to provide for their families, losing 1/10 of their harvest could be devastating. Yet it was not optional. The church wielded immense authority, and refusal to pay could bring both spiritual threats and earthly punishment. These obligations came in addition to the natural hardships of farming itself. Medieval agriculture was at the mercy of the weather. A cold spring could delay planting, while a summer drought could destroy crops. Too much rain could rot the harvest before it was gathered, and a harsh winter could wipe out livestock. Farmers had no protection against these forces. One bad season could bring hunger. Several bad seasons could bring famine, when entire regions faced starvation. Famine was a constant fear. Crop failure did not only mean less food for one family, it meant less for everyone. Prices in markets rose, and the poorest could no longer afford bread. Malnutrition weakened the body, making people more vulnerable to disease. The Middle Ages saw many such crises, when villages suffered together and thousands died of hunger. For peasants, every seed sown carried the weight of survival, and every harvest carried the risk of failure. Disease was another ever-present hardship. Medical knowledge was limited, and even small illnesses could become deadly. Poor nutrition and hard labor weakened the body, leaving peasants vulnerable to infections. Animals carried diseases that could spread quickly through herds, destroying vital sources of food. Outbreaks of plague or epidemic sickness swept through villages, leaving fields untended and families broken. For farmers, health was as fragile as the harvest itself. Daily life also carried physical risks. Farming tools were sharp and heavy. A slip of a sickle, a fall while guiding oxen, or even a broken bone could end a farmer's ability to work. Without modern medicine, injuries often became fatal. Even those who lived long lives bore the marks of constant labor, bent backs from plowing, worn hands from tools, and bodies weakened by years of endless work. Beyond the physical struggles were the social burdens. Peasants had little control over their lives. They could not freely move to another manor, marry without permission in some cases, or escape their obligations. Disputes with neighbors over land, animals, or resources could lead to fines. Lords could impose new demands, increase rents, or call upon peasants to perform additional tasks. The weight of authority was ever present, pressing down on families who already carried heavy loads. Despite these hardships, medieval farmers endured. They learned to stretch their resources, to rely on neighbors, and to accept the constant demands placed upon them. Their resilience came not from comfort but from necessity. They had no choice but to continue, because stopping meant death. The life of a medieval farmer was therefore a life of obligation. Work for the Lord. Payments to the church. Endless labor in the fields. And all of this under the constant threat of hunger, disease, and hardship. It was a life defined by duty and by struggle. Yet without this life, without the burdens carried by peasants, the medieval world could not have survived. The diet of a medieval farmer was simple, repetitive, and shaped almost entirely by what the land could provide. Food was never taken for granted. Every meal depended on the success of the harvest, the health of livestock, and the ability to store supplies through long winters. Unlike the wealthy, who could afford spices, fine meats, and imported goods, peasants survived on a narrow range of foods that filled the stomach but rarely offered comfort or variety. The foundation of their diet was bread. Bread was not only food, it was life. Almost every meal, from morning until night, included some form of bread. Wheat bread was considered the best, with a lighter texture and better taste, but wheat was expensive and not always available to poorer peasants. More often, bread was made from rye, barley, or a mixture of grains, producing a darker, heavier loaf. In hard years, when harvests failed, peasants sometimes had to mix in ground peas, beans, or even tree bark to stretch their flour further. This bread was coarse, filling, and sometimes difficult to digest, but it kept people alive. Alongside bread, the most common meal was pottage, a kind of thick stew made by boiling grains, vegetables, and whatever else could be found. Pottage could be simple, with just onions, cabbage, and a few herbs, or richer, if beans, peas, or bits of meat were available. It was eaten daily, simmering in a pot over the fire, with ingredients added or removed as they came and went. Some families kept the pot cooking almost constantly, adding scraps to it over time, so that pottage was less a single dish than an ever-changing mixture of whatever food was on hand. Vegetables formed another essential part of the diet. Cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, and garlic were common, often grown in small garden plots near cottages. These were hardy plants that grew reliably even in poor soil. Peasants ate them boiled, baked into pies, or added to pottage. Fresh vegetables were seasonal, but many could be stored or preserved for winter use. Root vegetables like turnips could be kept in cool cellars or pits, providing much-needed food during the cold months. Dairy products were valuable as well. Cows and goats provided milk, which was consumed fresh but more often turned into butter or cheese. Cheese was especially important because it lasted longer than milk and could be stored for months. It provided protein and fat that were otherwise scarce in the peasant diet. Butter was a luxury in some regions but common in others, depending on the availability of pasture land for cows. Meat was rare in the daily diet of peasants. Unlike the nobility, who ate beef, venison, and pork regularly, peasants ate meat only occasionally. Most of the animals they raised, cows, sheep, chickens, were too valuable alive to be eaten often. Cows provided milk, sheep provided wool, and chickens provided eggs. Killing them for meat was only done when they were too old to be useful, or when winter required slaughtering animals that could not be fed through the season. Pigs were the main source of meat, as they could forage freely and were usually slaughtered in the autumn. Their meat was salted, smoked, or dried to last the winter. Even then, portions were small, and meat was often used to flavor pottage rather than served in large pieces. Fish was more common, especially in regions near rivers, lakes, or the sea. Dried or salted fish could be transported long distances and stored for long periods. The church also required fasting from meat on certain days, which increased the importance of fish in the medieval diet. Peasants who lived inland, however, had limited access and relied more heavily on grains and vegetables. For drink, ale was the most common. Water was often unsafe, especially near villages where waste could contaminate wells and streams. Ale made from barley was weak in alcohol and safer to drink than water. It provided hydration and some nutrition. Children drank ale as well, though it was much less alcoholic than modern beer. Wealthier peasants might sometimes have cider made from apples, if orchards were nearby. The amount and quality of food depended heavily on the success of the harvest. In good years, meals were simple but steady. Bread, pottage, vegetables, some cheese, and perhaps a little meat. In bad years, food grew scarce. Families ate less, meals grew thinner, and hunger spread. Winter was always the hardest time. Supplies dwindled, and peasants rationed what little they had left. By spring, many families were weakened by hunger, just as the heavy labor of plowing and sowing began again. Preservation was a constant concern. Without refrigeration, food had to be salted, dried, smoked, or stored in cool, dry places. Grains were kept in barns or pits lined with clay, though these could still be ruined by dampness, rats, or insects. Meat was salted heavily to prevent spoilage, often making it tough and overly salty when eaten. Cheese, butter, and root vegetables lasted longer, but were still finite. Every meal had to be measured carefully, because wasting food could mean hunger later. The peasant diet may seem limited, but it was built for survival. Bread filled the stomach. Pottage provided warmth and nutrition. Vegetables, dairy, and occasional meat added variety when possible. Life did not allow for luxury, and food was valued not for its flavor, but for its ability to keep people alive through long days of work. Eating was not just about nutrition. It was also tied to obligations. Lords took a share of the harvest. The church claimed its tithe. What remained was divided among the family, and there was rarely much left over. Even during times of plenty, peasants ate modestly, because abundance was always temporary. A good harvest one year could be followed by disaster the next. For medieval farmers, diet and survival were inseparable. Every seed sown in spring, every animal tended in summer, every sheaf of grain cut in autumn, and every preserved store in winter was part of the same struggle, to have enough to eat until the cycle began again. It was a fragile balance, sustained by the land, threatened by weather, and shaped by obligations to lords and the church. Day after day, year after year, survival meant bread, pottage, and whatever else could be gathered, saved, or shared. When we look at medieval life as a whole, it becomes clear that farmers were not just one part of society, they were the foundation of it. Everything rested on their work. Without peasants working the land, there would have been no food for the lords, no resources for towns, and no wealth for kingdoms. Their labor quietly supported castles, churches, and armies, even though they themselves lived simple and often difficult lives. The structure of the medieval world was built on what is known as the feudal system. At the top were kings and powerful nobles, who granted land to lesser lords and knights in return for loyalty and military service. But all of that land had to be worked by someone. That responsibility fell on the peasants. They were the base of the pyramid, and without their efforts, the entire system would have collapsed. Knights, who trained for battle and protected their lords, depended on peasants to feed them. Castles, which stood as symbols of authority and defense, were supplied by the harvests of nearby villages. Monasteries and churches, which prayed, studied, and collected tithes, relied on the steady flow of food and goods produced by farmers. Even merchants in towns and cities, who traded cloth, wine, and iron, ultimately relied on the grain, wool, and livestock raised in the countryside. In this sense, medieval farmers were the invisible engine of society. They rarely appear in stories of kings or battles, but they were always there, providing the necessities of life. Bread on the table, wool for clothing, leather for shoes, hay for animals, and timber for building. All of these began with the labor of peasants. Their work was not glamorous, and it was rarely celebrated, but it sustained everything else. This dependence made farmers vulnerable. Lords demanded taxes and services because they knew peasants could not simply refuse. The church insisted on its tithe because it knew that food was essential, and even the poorest farmer had to give up a share. Wars, raids, and conflicts often swept across farmland, destroying crops and burning villages, yet the cycle of farming had to continue regardless. The survival of the realm always depended on peasants returning to their fields once the smoke had cleared. And yet, despite the hardships and burdens, medieval farming communities endured. Generation after generation, they repeated the same cycle: sowing in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn, and surviving in winter. Their knowledge of the land, passed down from parent to child, kept villages alive even in the face of famine, plague, or war. The bigger picture also shows how farming shaped the economy of medieval Europe. Grain was not only food but also a form of wealth. Surpluses could be sold at markets or used to pay debts. Wool, produced by sheep tended by peasants, became one of the most important exports, especially from regions like England. This trade enriched merchants, funded towns, and eventually fueled the growth of long-distance commerce. Behind every coin exchanged in a market was the work of a farmer who had planted, tended, and harvested. Farming also shaped the landscape itself. The patchwork of fields, hedgerows, meadows, and villages that we associate with medieval Europe was created by centuries of peasant labor. Forests were cleared to make room for fields. Wetlands were drained to open new farmland. Hillsides were terraced to hold crops. The look of the countryside, still visible in many regions today, is a direct result of medieval farming practices. Even culture and tradition were tied to farming. Festivals marked the rhythm of the agricultural year. May Day celebrations welcomed the return of spring. Harvest festivals gave thanks for food gathered before winter. Saints' days were linked to planting or weather, with prayers for rain or sunshine to bless the crops. Religion, community, and farming blended into one rhythm, and peasants found meaning in the cycle that governed their lives. In the bigger picture, we also see the limits of medieval farming. Productivity was low compared to modern standards. A single harvest might yield only a few times the amount of seed sown. Famines came often. Populations rose and fell depending on the success of the land. Yet for all its fragility, the system held together. It fed millions of people over centuries, not through abundance, but through persistence and the steady work of countless farmers. It is easy to overlook the importance of peasants when studying medieval history. Kings fought wars, knights rode into battle, and churches built cathedrals that still stand today. But none of those things would have been possible without farmers working quietly in their fields. Their labor, though humble, was the foundation on which medieval Europe stood. In the end, the story of medieval farming is the story of survival. It is a story of men, women, and children who rose at dawn, worked until dusk, and lived their lives bound to the soil. They endured obligations, hardships, and hunger, yet they kept going because there was no alternative. Their work fed not only their own families, but entire kingdoms. And though history often remembers the lords, knights, and kings, it was the farmers who carried the true weight of the medieval world. The sun has not yet crested the eastern hills, but the world is already beginning to stir. A low mist clings to the valleys, a soft gray blanket over sleeping fields. In the distance, a rooster crows, a solitary trumpet call answered by another, and then another, a chain reaction of sound heralding the new day. This is not our world of electric light and instant communication. This is a world governed by the sun and the seasons, a world of soil and sweat, of patient, back-breaking labor that forms the very foundation of our modern existence. This is the world of the medieval farmer, and to understand their life is to understand the rhythm of the earth itself, a rhythm we have largely forgotten, but one that still beats faintly in our collective memory. Their day began in this half-light, long before most of us would even consider stirring from our beds. There was no alarm clock, no snooze button, only the ingrained knowledge of a body and a spirit attuned to the celestial clock. The first sensation was not sight, but sound and smell. The chill of the morning air, carrying the rich, loamy scent of turned earth from yesterday's plowing, mixed with the damp, woody aroma of the forest that bordered their world. The sound of their own breath, visible in the cool air, and the stirring of livestock in the byre attached to their small timber-framed home. This was not a life of luxury, but it was a life of profound connection, a direct and unbroken line between their efforts and their survival. The medieval farmer did not own the land in the way we think of ownership today. The vast majority were peasants, and among them, many were villeins, bound to the land and to the lord of the manor. The land was not a commodity to be bought and sold. It was the source of all life, a sacred trust. The manor itself was a self-contained universe, a microcosm of agriculture and industry. At its heart stood the lord's domain, the best land worked directly by the peasants as part of their rent, their labor service. Then there were the strips and the open fields that they were allocated to feed their own families. This system, the open field system or champion farming, defined the landscape. Imagine not the neat hedge squares of today's countryside, but a vast, sprawling quilt of long, thin strips, each belonging to a different family, all working the land in common. It was a system of shared responsibility and shared risk, a community literally woven into the fabric of the soil. The tools they used were simple, extensions of their own hands and strength. The most important was the plow, a heavy, cumbersome beast of wood and iron, often pulled by a team of oxen, which were stronger and hardier than horses for this purpose. The design of the plow was a marvel of incremental innovation. The ard, an ancient scratch plow, simply cut a furrow into the soil. But the true revolution was the moldboard plow, a heavier implement with a curved plate that turned the sod over, burying weeds and bringing fresh nutrients to the surface. This was back-breaking work. One man would guide the plow, fighting to keep the share biting into the earth at the right depth, while another led the oxen, coaxing and urging them forward with a stick and a steady stream of encouragement. The sound was a symphony of effort. The deep, rhythmic breathing of the oxen, the creak of wooden yokes and leather harnesses, the scrape and tear of the plowshare through the stubborn earth, and the steady, murmured instructions between man and boy. This was the foundational act of their year, the turning of the soil in preparation for the seed, an act of faith performed with calloused hands and aching backs. And after the plowing came the sowing. This was not the mechanical, precise drilling of modern agriculture. This was an act that felt almost like a ritual. The farmer would walk across the freshly turned furrows with a basket of seed grain hung from his neck, and with a practiced sweeping motion of his arm, he would cast the seed broadcast across the land. It was a dance, a movement of graceful economy, each swing of the arm sending a golden arc of potential life flying into the waiting earth. He had to have an eye for the wind, a feel for the soil, an innate sense of how to achieve an even spread. It looked simple, but it was a skill born of a lifetime of observation. He was not just planting wheat or barley or rye. He was planting hope. He was casting the very future of his family, his village, into the generosity of the soil and the mercy of the weather. Then came the waiting, the long, patient vigil over the growing crop. This was not a passive time, for the earth required constant tending. Weeds were a relentless enemy, stealing precious water and nutrients from the fragile young shoots. They would be pulled by hand, a tedious, back-aching chore performed under the warming spring sun. Children would often be tasked with scaring away birds with shouts and clattering sticks, protecting the tender green shoots that meant life itself. The farmer's eyes were constantly on the sky, reading the clouds for signs of rain or drought, for a late frost that could wipe out a season's work in a single cruel night. Their lives were a negotiation with forces far beyond their control, a lesson in humility and resilience that we have largely insulated ourselves from. The rhythm of their year was dictated by the seasons, each with its own specific and vital tasks. The agricultural year began not in January, but in autumn with the plowing of the fields after the harvest. Then came the sowing of the winter crops, like wheat and rye, which would lie dormant through the cold months before sprouting again in the spring. Winter was a time of maintenance and indoor work. Tools were repaired, harnesses were stitched, wood was chopped. It was a time of relative rest, but also of anxiety, as families watched their stored food supplies dwindle and prayed that the winter would not be too long or too harsh. The hearth was the center of the home, a source of warmth and light around which stories were told and skills were passed down to the next generation. Spring was an explosion of activity and renewed hope. The spring sowing of barley, oats, peas, and beans took place. The livestock, which had been kept through the winter on meager rations of hay, were finally turned out to graze on the common land, their joyful release a sign that life was returning to the world. The air would be filled with the sound of bleating lambs and the lowing of cattle. Summer was the time of haymaking, a frantic race against the weather to cut, dry, and store enough grass to feed the animals through the next winter. Men, women, and children would all work together in the meadows, swinging scythes and turning the hay with wooden rakes, their movements a well-rehearsed ballet of communal effort. But the pinnacle of the entire year, the moment of greatest tension and greatest reward, was the harvest. This was the climax of their labor, the test of everything they had worked for since the last autumn. The entire community mobilized for the harvest. Every able-bodied person was needed in the fields. The men would move in lines, swinging their long-handled scythes in a steady, rhythmic motion, cutting the golden stalks close to the ground. Behind them came the women and children, gathering the fallen grain into sheaves and tying them with straw bands. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ripe grain, and the field echoed with the sounds of work songs, calls, and the constant swish of the blades. It was hot, exhausting work from dawn until dusk, but it was work infused with a palpable sense of urgency and purpose. The weather was a constant threat. A single thunderstorm could flatten a field of grain or ruin the cut stalks, rendering a year of labor worthless. The harvest was a race, a collective holding of breath until the last sheaf was safely gathered and stacked into stooks to dry. Once the grain was cut and dried, it was taken to the barn for threshing, the process of separating the precious kernels from the husks and straw. This was often winter work, done with flails on the hard-packed earth of the barn floor. Then came winnowing, tossing the threshed grain into the air so the wind could blow away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grain to fall back to the ground. It was a process of purification, a final step to secure the fruits of their labor. The grain was their lifeblood. It was ground into flour for the dark, hearty bread that was the staple of their diet. It was brewed into ale, the most common drink, safer than often contaminated water. It was everything. But their world was not just grain. The medieval farmer's life was a diverse tapestry of activities. Around their cottages, they had small garden plots where they grew vegetables like cabbages, onions, leeks, and herbs for both food and medicine. They might keep a pig, which would forage in the woods for acorns and beech mast before being slaughtered in the autumn and salted to provide meat through the winter. They kept chickens for eggs and occasionally for meat. They might keep a few sheep for wool, which the women would spin and weave into cloth to make their own clothes. They collected firewood from the surrounding woodland, though these rights were strictly controlled by the Lord. They fished in local streams and ponds. They knew which mushrooms were safe to eat and which plants could heal a wound or reduce a fever. Their knowledge of the natural world was intimate, detailed, and essential for survival. This life was one of immense hardship. Their diet was monotonous and the clang of steel on steel echoed through the mist-shrouded valleys, a metallic chorus announcing the dawn of a new era of conflict. As the 14th century unfolded, the very foundations of medieval society began to tremble under the weight of its own contradictions. The feudal order, that intricate tapestry of oaths and obligations woven over centuries, was fraying at the edges, threatened by the emergence of professional armies, the slow decay of chivalric ideals, and the relentless pressure of economic transformation. Kings no longer relied solely on the 40 days of service owed by their vassals. Instead, they increasingly turned to paid companies of men-at-arms and longbowmen, a shift that would forever alter the relationship between monarch, nobility, and the common fighting man. This military revolution found its most brutal and eloquent expression in the long, bloody conflict that would come to be known as the 100 Years' War, a sprawling dynastic struggle between the Plantagenet kings of England and the Valois monarchs of France. It was a war that defied its name, stretching intermittently from 1337 to 1453. A century of fire and blood that scarred the landscape and psyche of Western Europe. The conflict's origins were tangled in the thorny thicket of feudal law and national ambition. The English crown, through its ancestral holdings in Aquitaine, remained a vassal of the French king for these rich wine-producing lands, a humiliating and untenable situation for a monarch who considered himself every bit the equal of his Capetian rival. The final spark was struck in 1328 with the death of Charles IV of France, the last direct Capetian king. Edward III of England, son of Charles's sister Isabella, pressed his claim through the maternal line. The French nobility, invoking an ancient Salic law they conveniently exhumed for the occasion, which barred inheritance through the female line, instead crowned Philip VI, the first of the Valois kings. What began as a feudal dispute over the complex web of vassalage quickly metastasized into a full-blown war of national identity. It was on the battlefield, however, that the true nature of this transformation was revealed, and nowhere more decisively than at Crécy, on August 26, 1346. Edward III's army, exhausted and outnumbered by the pursuing forces of Philip VI, took a defensive position on a gentle slope near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The English host was a new kind of army, a hybrid force built around a corps of disciplined longbowmen, yeomen and freemen drawn from the villages and towns of England, armed with a weapon that was about to change history. The 6-foot yew longbow was not merely a weapon, it was a feat of medieval engineering and a testament to a society that had institutionalized martial skill. Years of training were required to draw its staggering 150 to 180-pound draw weight, an effort that deformed the skeletons of its practitioners, leaving telltale markers on their shoulders and spines discernible to archaeologists centuries later. This training was enforced by royal decree. Edward I had commanded that all able-bodied men practice at the butts every Sunday, transforming a national pastime into a strategic reserve of devastating power. The arrow, tipped with a needle-point bodkin head capable of punching through mail and even thinning plate, could be loosed with terrifying speed and accuracy. A skilled archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows a minute, creating a steel-tipped hailstorm that could eviscerate a charging formation long before it reached the English lines. At Crécy, this theory was put to the ultimate test. The French army, the flower of European chivalry, was a magnificent, glittering, and utterly overconfident host. Knights and noblemen, eager for glory and ransom, jostled for position, their discipline crumbling in the face of individual ambition. The first assault was led by thousands of Genoese crossbowmen, hired mercenaries whose weapons, though powerful, were slow to reload, especially after a hurried march that had left their protective pavises back with the baggage train. As they advanced, a sudden thunderstorm broke over the field, wetting the strings of their crossbows and reducing their effectiveness. The English longbows, their strings conveniently unstrung until the rain passed, now sang their deadly song. A cloud of arrows descended upon the Genoese, so thick that it seemed like snow, as the chronicler Froissart would later write. The mercenaries broke and fled, only to be cut down by the furious French knights, who saw their retreat as cowardice, screaming, "Kill this rabble!" This chaos was the prelude to the main event. 15 more blind, furious charges by the French heavy cavalry up the slippery slope into the withering arrow storm and the waiting English men-at-arms. The knights, trained for the glorious mêlée, found themselves pin-cushioned and unhorsed, their heavy armor a death trap in the muddy churn, where they were easily dispatched by Welsh and English knifemen using long daggers to slip through the visors and gaps in their plate. The carnage was unprecedented. The blind King John of Bohemia, tied to his saddle and led into the fray by his faithful knights in a final act of chivalric defiance, was found dead amidst a circle of his slain retainers. The cream of French nobility lay dead on the field. The Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Blois, the Count of Flanders, and over 1,500 other knights and nobles. English losses, by contrast, were trifling, perhaps a few hundred. The myth of knightly invincibility had been shattered, not by other knights, but by commoners with a stick and a string. The moral and political shockwaves would reverberate for generations, signaling that the old feudal order, where social rank dictated battlefield dominance, was irrevocably broken. Yet, if Crécy demonstrated the changing art of war, the next great calamity to befall Europe was an indiscriminate killer that respected neither rank nor skill at arms. Even as the English and French crowns mobilized their resources for a long conflict, a far more sinister enemy was moving along the trade routes from the east. In 1347, a Mongol army besieging the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in the Crimea, itself ravaged by a mysterious illness, began catapulting their plague-ridden dead over the city walls in one of history's first recorded acts of biological warfare. The terrified Italian merchants fleeing the city in their ships carried with them more than just silks and spices. They carried the Black Death. The bacterium Yersinia pestis found a perfect ecosystem in the densely populated, unsanitary cities of medieval Europe. Fleas, living on black rats, were the vector, and they found ample breeding grounds in the thatched roofs, wooden houses, and piles of refuse that characterized urban life. The disease manifested in three forms: the bubonic, characterized by swollen, blackened, and agonizingly painful lymph nodes called buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck; the pneumonic, which attacked the lungs and was spread through the air with a mere cough, almost always fatal; and the septicemic, which infected the blood, killing its victims so quickly they often dropped dead without any prior symptoms. The speed and horror of the plague were unimaginable. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by supper. The Italian writer Boccaccio, in his introduction to the Decameron, described the terror in Florence. Such was the cruelty of heaven, that between March and July, more than 100,000 human beings lost their lives within the walls of Florence. How many grand palaces, how many stately homes, how many splendid residences, once full of retainers, of lords, of ladies, were now left desolate? How many families of historic fame and vast estates were now left without a single representative? Society's structures crumbled under the strain. Priests and doctors, those who were supposed to offer solace and cure, died in droves, their proximity to the sick sealing their fate. Graveyards overflowed. Mass graves or plague pits were dug by convicts paid exorbitant sums, who often drank themselves into a stupor to cope with the horror. The stench of death was omnipresent. Some turned to wild debauchery, reasoning that the end was near and pleasure was all that remained. Others, the flagellants, marched from town to town in ragged processions, whipping their own backs into a bloody pulp in a frenzy of penitential fervor, believing the plague was God's wrath for a sinful world. Their movement was eventually condemned by a terrified papacy, which saw its own authority undermined by these fanatical wandering bands. The scapegoating began with predictable, tragic fury. Jews, often living in separate quarters and sometimes following slightly better sanitary practices that led to marginally lower mortality rates, were accused of poisoning wells. Terrible pogroms erupted across the Rhineland and Switzerland. Entire communities were burned alive in their synagogues or expelled, their property seized by their murderers. The economic and social consequences of the Black Death were profound and paradoxical. It killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, a demographic catastrophe that created a severe labor shortage. For the surviving peasantry, This was an unexpected boon. The value of their labor skyrocketed. They could now demand higher wages and better terms from landlords desperate to have their fields sown and harvested. The old manorial system, built on a vast supply of cheap tied labor, began to collapse under the weight of this new economic reality. Governments, dominated by the landowning classes, reacted with brutal repression. The English Statute. The clang of steel echoed through the mist-shrouded valleys, a metallic chorus heralding the dawn of a new age in Europe. As the last vestiges of Roman authority dissolved like morning fog beneath the rising sun, the continent found itself plunged into what later historians would call the Dark Ages, though darkness implies absence, when in truth this era teemed with life, struggle, and the painful, glorious birth of something entirely new. The year is 476 AD. Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor whose name ironically harkened back to both Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, has been deposed. Odoacer, a Germanic general of uncertain tribe, perhaps Syrian, perhaps Rugian, claims the purple cloak not for himself, but sends it east to Constantinople with a message that the West no longer needs an emperor. The gesture is profound in its simplicity. One empire, under one emperor, ruling from the new Rome on the Bosphorus. But in reality, the Western Roman Empire is dead, its territories now a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, where Latin senators rubbed shoulders with Gothic warlords. Imagine the world Odoacer inherited. Aqueducts still carried water to cities, though many were beginning to crumble from lack of maintenance. Roman roads, those magnificent arteries of empire, still stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, though now they carried Frankish merchants and Vandal raiders rather than Roman legions. In the Forum, the basilica still stood, but the statues of emperors now watched over markets where Gothic was spoken as often as Latin. The change was both sudden and gradual. The administration continued, taxes were still collected, often by Germanic officials now, and the complex bureaucracy of empire sputtered along like a machine whose operator had stepped away, but whose gears continued turning by momentum alone. What followed Odoacer's coup was not immediate collapse, but rather a strange twilight period where Roman and Germanic cultures began their centuries-long dance of fusion. Theodoric the Great, an Ostrogoth raised as a hostage in Constantinople, would later overthrow Odoacer and establish a kingdom that consciously preserved Roman traditions while adapting to Germanic realities. Ravenna, not Rome, became the capital of this Ostrogothic kingdom, and walking its streets today, one can still see the fascinating synthesis. Roman mosaics depicting Germanic-style armor, Latin inscriptions bearing Gothic names, churches that blend classical proportions with northern decorative motifs. Theodoric himself remains one of history's most fascinating transitional figures, a barbarian king who admired Roman civilization yet never fully mastered its written language, a conqueror who prided himself on maintaining the aqueducts, sewers, and public buildings of the civilization he had ostensibly overthrown. His reign demonstrates the complex reality of the so-called barbarian invasions. Most Germanic peoples didn't want to destroy Rome. They wanted to become part of it, to enjoy its comforts and sophistication while maintaining their own identity and traditions. Theodoric's famous edict that Romani must be protected by arms, Goths by law, perfectly captures this delicate balancing act between conqueror and conquered, between old and new. Meanwhile, in Gaul, another Germanic people were putting down roots that would prove even more enduring. The Franks, under the cunning leadership of Clovis, were expanding their territory through a combination of military prowess and strategic conversion to Catholic Christianity. While most Germanic tribes had converted to Arian Christianity, a heresy that denied the full divinity of Christ, Clovis's embrace of Orthodox Catholicism gave him a powerful ideological advantage over his rivals, and allowed him to present himself as the defender of the Gallo-Roman population against heretical Germanic rulers. The story of Clovis's conversion, as related by Gregory of Tours, has the quality of legend. During a desperate battle against the Alemanni, Clovis supposedly raised his eyes to heaven and cried, "Jesus Christ, if you shall grant me victory over these enemies, I will believe in you and be baptized in your name." When victory followed, Clovis kept his promise, being baptized along with 3,000 of his warriors on Christmas Day, likely in 498 AD. The image of these hardened Germanic warriors submitting to the waters of baptism represents one of the great turning points in European history, the beginning of the fusion of Germanic military culture with Roman Christianity that would characterize the Middle Ages. Clovis's conversion had immediate practical benefits. The Catholic bishops of Gaul, mostly drawn from the old Roman aristocracy, threw their support behind the Frankish king, seeing in him a protector against both Arian Germanic rulers and the lingering threat of pagan resurgence. This alliance between Frankish monarchy and Catholic episcopacy would prove enormously significant, creating a template for church-state relations that would endure for centuries. The bishops brought with them not just spiritual authority but practical administrative skills, literacy, legal knowledge, and experience in governance that helped the Franks transition from warband to kingdom. As the 6th century unfolded, this pattern repeated across the former Western Empire. In Spain, the Visigoths eventually abandoned Arianism for Catholicism under King Ricard in 589, cementing their rule over the Iberian Peninsula. In Italy, the Lombards established a kingdom that would endure for 2 centuries despite constant pressure from the Byzantine Empire. In North Africa, the Vandal kingdom maintained its Arian faith and naval power until crushed by the Byzantine general Belisarius in Justinian's ambitious reconquest. Yet Justinian's legacy extends far beyond military campaigns. His codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, preserved the legal heritage of Rome for posterity, creating a foundation that would influence European law for centuries to come. The magnificent Hagia Sophia, rebuilt after the Nika riots, still stands as testament to Byzantine architectural and engineering prowess, its vast dome seeming to float on a cascade of light. Justinian's reign represents both the persistence of Roman tradition and its transformation into something new, the Byzantine Empire that would carry the flame of classical civilization through the darkest centuries ahead. But even as Justinian's armies celebrated victories in the west, new threats were gathering on the horizon. In 541, bubonic plague arrived in Constantinople, probably from Egypt, and proceeded to ravage the Mediterranean world. The plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, may have killed as much as half the population in some regions, dealing a devastating blow to the already fragile economy and social structure of the late ancient world. Imagine the terror, people going to bed healthy and dead by morning, ships drifting aimlessly with entire crews perished, cities where the living could not bury the dead quickly enough. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Here was a catastrophe that no army could fight, no walls could keep out, a reminder of human vulnerability that would find echoes in the Black Death 8 centuries later. The plague accelerated changes already underway. Urban decline, ruralization, the weakening of central authority. In its wake, the Mediterranean world became poorer, less connected, more localized. Long-distance trade declined as populations shrank and markets disappeared. The complex economic system of the Roman Empire, with its specialized production and extensive trade networks, gave way to more self-sufficient regional economies. The silver and bronze coinage that had facilitated commerce across the empire became scarcer, with many regions reverting to barter or local credit systems. Into this weakened world came new invaders from unexpected directions. While the Germanic migrations had largely run their course by the 6th century, new nomadic peoples began pressing on Europe's frontiers. The Avars, a Turkic people from the Central Asian steppes, established a powerful khaganate in the Carpathian Basin, from which they launched devastating raids into Byzantine territory. Their skilled cavalry, equipped with stirrups, a technology relatively new to Europe, could cover astonishing distances with terrifying speed. The Byzantine Empire found itself fighting on multiple fronts, against Persians in the east, Avars and Slavs in the Balkans, and various Germanic tribes in the west. The Slavs, previously little-known tribes dwelling north of the Black Sea, began their great migration into the Balkans during this period. Unlike the Germanic peoples, who had often sought to integrate with Roman civilization, The Slavs seemed content to settle in more remote areas, practicing agriculture and establishing villages rather than attempting to capture cities. Their gradual infiltration of the Balkan Peninsula would have lasting consequences, creating the ethnic geography that persists to this day. The Byzantine Empire found it could not stop this demographic tide. Instead, it gradually Christianized and assimilated the Slavic peoples, though not before they had permanently altered the ethnic composition of southeastern Europe. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the 7th century saw the gradual consolidation of the Frankish kingdom under the Merovingian dynasty, though consolidation may be too generous a term for what was often a bloody struggle among rival branches of the royal family. The Merovingians have come down in history as the long-haired kings, their uncut hair symbolizing their sacred royal status. Later Carolingian propaganda would depict them as ois fainéants, do-nothing kings, who left actual governance to their mayors of the palace, but recent scholarship has shown this to be an exaggeration. The Merovingians remained active warriors and rulers, though their kingdom was often divided among brothers and plagued by fratricidal conflict. The clatter of hooves on cobblestone echoed through the narrow streets as the sun began its slow descent behind the castle's formidable silhouette. Inside the great hall, torches flickered, casting dancing shadows upon tapestries that whispered of forgotten battles and ancient lineages. The air was thick with the scent of roasting boar, spiced wine, and the faint, ever-present odor of damp stone and wood smoke, a fragrance that clung to every corner of the fortress, a constant reminder of the era's raw, unvarnished reality. King Alaric, his brow furrowed with the weight of rulership, sat upon a high-backed oaken chair, its carvings depicting scenes of myth and conquest. His fingers, calloused from years of wielding sword and scepter alike, drummed a restless rhythm on the armrest. Before him, a parchment lay unfurled, its edges slightly curled from the heat of the hearth. It was a message from the northern borders, where the wild, untamed lands of the MacTiernan clan bristled with unrest. The words, penned in the hurried script of a garrison commander, spoke of raids, swift, brutal, and vanishing like mist before any retribution could be exacted. These were not the grand armies of old, clashing in open fields beneath the banners of rival kings. This was a new kind of conflict, a war of shadows and attrition, fought in the glens and forests by men who knew the land as intimately as their own heartbeat. The MacTiernans, a proud and ferocious people, had never fully bowed to the crown, viewing the stone keeps and levied taxes of the central monarchy as foreign impositions upon their ancient way of life. Their chieftain, a man named Calin, was a figure more of legend than of politics, said to command the very loyalty of the rocks and rivers themselves. Alaric's kingdom, painstakingly assembled by his father and grandfather through a combination of strategic marriage, military might, and shrewd diplomacy, was a fragile tapestry. Each thread was a barony, a county, a duchy, each with its own proud traditions, simmering rivalries, and grudges that stretched back generations. The peace he maintained was a tense, watchful thing, a sword's edge balance that required constant vigilance. A spark in the north could easily become a conflagration that would consume everything if the southern lords of the fertile plains saw an opportunity to press their own claims or settle old scores, or if the eastern coastal cities, rich from trade but vulnerable to naval blockade, decided their allegiance was negotiable. His thoughts were interrupted by the heavy footfall of his castellan, Lord Valerius. A man whose youth had been spent on the battlefields that had forged the kingdom, Valerius now bore the scars of that service not just on his leathery skin, but in the cautious, measured way he moved and spoke. He approached the dais, his mail shirt whispering with each step. "Your Grace," Valerius began, his voice a low rumble that carried easily over the murmur of the hall. "The scouts have returned. They confirm the commander's report. The attacks are targeted, precise. They strike at granaries, at smithies, at the very supply lines that sustain our northern garrisons. They are not seeking glory in battle. They are seeking to strangle our presence there." Alaric leaned back, his gaze fixed on the roaring fire in the immense hearth. The flames seemed to mimic the turmoil in his mind. "They are not trying to defeat us in the field, Valerius. They are trying to make the cost of holding the north too high to bear. They seek to bleed us slowly, to make us withdraw out of exhaustion rather than defeat. A strategy of the weak, Valerius grunted, though his eyes betrayed a grudging respect for its effectiveness. Is it? Alaric mused. Or is it the strategy of those who understand that strength is not always measured in the number of knights one can field? They have the land. They have the patience. We have administration. And administration is a fragile thing when it is starved. He unrolled a large vellum map, weighted down by silver goblets at its corners. The kingdom sprawled across it in inks of black and ochre and vermilion, a cartographer's dream of order and boundary. But Alaric knew these lines were illusions. Power did not reside in the lines, but in the spaces between them, in the loyalties of the peasants who tilled the soil, in the allegiances of the minor knights who held scattered keeps, in the flow of goods along the muddy tracks that passed for roads. His finger traced the route from the capital to the northern marches. It was a long, vulnerable artery, winding through dense forests and over treacherous mountain passes. We must secure the route, not just with patrols, but with presence. We need to show the northerners that our will is not just a parchment decree from a distant castle. It is stone and mortar and steel. New fortifications? Valerius asked, his tactical mind already racing ahead. It is late in the season, Your Grace. The rains will come soon. The ground will turn to mud. It would be a brutal campaign of construction for the men. It must be done, Alaric said, his voice leaving no room for debate. We will begin with a series of fortified way stations, watchtowers that can see into the deep glens. We will offer incentives to blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons to settle in the new towns that will grow around these points of strength. We will not just conquer the land, we will begin to digest it. This was the grim, unglamorous work of empire building. It was not the stuff of epic poems, which preferred to sing of singular heroic duels and the fate of kingdoms decided in an afternoon. This was a slower, more profound transformation. The clearing of land, the raising of walls, the establishment of law and market. It was the process of turning a contested frontier into a settled shire, of replacing the old tribal loyalties with the new, impersonal machinery of the state. It was a war fought with plowshares and chisels as much as with swords. The decision made, a flurry of activity erupted from the castle. Riders were dispatched to the four corners of the kingdom, carrying the king's summons for levies, not of fighting men, but of craftsmen and laborers. The royal stewards began the immense logistical task of organizing supplies. Tons of grain and salted meat, countless barrels of ale, iron nails by the thousand, axes, saws, chisels, and great quantities of stone and timber to be quarried and felled. The kingdom was like a great beast stirring, its attention turning northward. In the villages and hamlets that dotted the river valleys, the king's summons were met with a mixture of dread and opportunity. For the young and landless, it was a chance to earn coin and perhaps claim a plot of their own in a new territory. For fathers of families, it was a fearful prospect. Months of backbreaking labor in a harsh and dangerous land, far from their fields and families. The bailiffs and sheriffs moved from town to town, reading the proclamation in market squares, their voices competing with the cackle of geese and the murmur of the gathered crowds. Meanwhile, in the mist-shrouded highlands, Caelan McTiernan received his own reports. His hall was not of stone, but of great timber beams and woven wattle, nestled in a hidden valley that did not appear on any of Alaric's maps. The air here smelled of peat smoke, damp wool, and the pungent aroma of brewing heather ale. The news of the Southern King's plans was delivered by a young, fleet-footed runner, his breath pluming in the cold evening air. Caelan listened, his face an impassive mask. He was a man who seemed carved from the same granite as his homeland, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a presence that commanded silence. When the runner finished, Caelan dismissed him with a nod and turned to his council of elders, men whose faces were leathery maps of a lifetime spent in the elements. He does not send an army, Caelan said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. He sends masons. He sends tax collectors. He sends the slow, patient poison of his civilization. He seeks to build a cage around us, stone by stone. A battle we can win. A wall is harder to fight. An old chieftain, his beard white as snow, spoke up. Then we must break their walls before they are built, burn their timber, scatter their stones. Show them that our hills reject their foundations. But Kalin shook his head slowly. That is what he expects. That is the reaction of a cornered beast. It would play into his hands, giving his knights a clear enemy to hunt in the open. No, we must be smarter. We must be the mist and the shadow. If he builds a watchtower, we will not attack it. We will watch the watchers. We will learn their routines, their weaknesses. We will turn the families of the men who build them, the local crofters, the herders, into our eyes and ears. Fear is a tool, but resentment is a far deeper and more lasting foundation. We will make his new subjects resent his rule before it has even truly begun. And so a different kind of preparation began in the highlands. Not the gathering of a great host. The clatter of hooves on cobblestone echoed through the narrow streets of York as the royal procession made its way toward the towering minster. King Edward III, his face set in grim determination beneath a jeweled crown, rode at the head of a column of knights whose armor gleamed dully in the damp English air. It was 1337, and the air itself seemed charged with the tension of impending conflict. The king's gaze swept over the gathered crowds. Merchants in woolen tunics, peasants with calloused hands clutching at their caps, clergymen in dark robes who watched with calculating eyes. Every face told a story of anticipation, of the collective breath being held before the storm. Edward dismounted before the great western doors of the minster, his crimson cloak swirling about him like a pool of blood upon the stones. The Archbishop of York awaited him, golden crozier in hand, his expression a carefully composed mask of piety and political awareness. Together they entered the cavernous nave, where the scent of incense and old stone filled the air, and the light from 100 candles danced upon the carved saints that watched from their niches high above. The king knelt before the high altar, not in submission to divine will, but to harness it, to bend the power of the church to his earthly purposes. For the declaration he was about to make would need all the sanction heaven could provide. The French crown, his voice rang out in the sudden silence, has through Philip VI's treachery and faithlessness, forfeited its right to the territories granted to our ancestors by solemn treaty and divine providence. The words hung in the air, each one measured and heavy with consequence. The Duchy of Aquitaine, won by the blood of our forefathers, now lies threatened by French avarice. Gascony, our ancient possession, suffers under their unjust demands. Therefore, by right of inheritance through our mother Isabella, daughter of Philip the Fair, we hereby claim the crown of France itself. A murmur swept through the congregation, not of surprise, for this had been brewing for years, but of grim acknowledgment. The claim was tenuous, built upon a deliberate misinterpretation of Salic law that barred inheritance through the female line, but legality mattered less than opportunity. Edward knew well that the French monarchy, centralized and growing in power, threatened to encircle and strangle English continental holdings. War was not merely preferable to submission, it was inevitable. Beyond the minster's stained glass windows, England was changing. The three estates, nobility, clergy, and commons, had begun to find their voice in Parliament, which Edward had learned to manipulate even as he strengthened it. The old feudal levies, unreliable and bound by 40 days of service, were giving way to paid indentures. Professional soldiers contracted for specific campaigns. The yeoman with his longbow, once a humble hunter, now became the backbone of England's military might, his weapon capable of piercing French armor and changing the very nature of medieval warfare. The king rose from his knees, his eyes burning with ambition and calculation. The 100 Years' War had begun not with a single battle, but with words in a cathedral, words that would echo across generations, that would drain both kingdoms of men and treasure, that would see fields watered with blood from Crécy to Agincourt, and that would ultimately transform the very nature of kingship, nationhood, and warfare in Western Europe. As Edward emerged from the minster, the sunlight breaking through the clouds seemed to set his crown afire. He looked not toward France, but north, where the Scottish threat still simmered, a reminder that war would be fought on multiple fronts. The intricate dance of diplomacy had already begun, with envoys scurrying to the Low Countries, to the German principalities, to the Iberian kingdoms, seeking alliances built on promises of plunder and territorial gain. The wool trade, England's economic lifeblood, would become both weapon and prize in the coming conflict. The first campaigns were characterized by chevauchés, devastating raids deep into French territory designed to destroy resources, undermine morale, and demonstrate the impotence of the Valois monarchy. Towns were put to the torch, crops burned, populations scattered or slaughtered. It was warfare as economic sabotage and psychological terror, and it brought untold suffering to the peasantry caught between two rival kings. In 1340, the English fleet encountered the French at Sluys. The narrow harbor became a charnel house as English longbowmen rained death upon the closely packed French vessels. Ships grappled together in mortal combat, men fighting hand to hand on decks slick with blood. When the battle ended, the sea was clotted with wreckage and corpses, and French naval power was broken for a generation. Edward had secured his channel crossing, but the cost in lives was staggering, a preview of the carnage to come. Meanwhile, in the English countryside, the war transformed daily life. Tax collectors moved from village to village, demanding payments to fund the king's ambitions. The wool trade was manipulated, with exports sometimes banned to hurt Flemish manufacturers dependent on English fleeces, sometimes taxed heavily to fill the royal coffers. In manors across the land, peasants found their obligations changing as lords sought to maximize revenue for their own military expenses. The social fabric stretched and strained under these pressures, storing up resentments that would decades later explode in the peasants' revolt. The French response was initially characterized by caution and frustration. Philip VI preferred grand set-piece battles, but Edward avoided them, choosing instead to raid and withdraw. The French countryside learned to fear the appearance of English banners on the horizon, the glint of arrowheads, the smoke of burning homesteads, the cries of the defenseless. Chivalry, that code of honor so celebrated in tournaments and romances, showed its darker face in the reality of medieval warfare. By 1346, Edward felt confident enough to launch a major invasion. Landing in Normandy, his army marched toward Paris, then turned north toward Flanders, pursued by a much larger French force. The two armies met near the village of Crécy on August 26. Edward positioned his forces on a slope, dismounted his men-at-arms, and deployed his longbowmen on the flanks. The Genoese crossbowmen in French service advanced first, but their weapons were outranged by the English longbows, and a sudden rainstorm had dampened their strings. They fell in droves under the arrow storm, and when the French knights charged through their retreating ranks, disorder turned to disaster. The flower of French chivalry foundered in the mud and blood of that slope. Armor that had seemed impregnable in tournaments proved vulnerable to yard-long arrows shot with terrible force. Horses screamed and fell, throwing their riders to be trampled or finished off by English men-at-arms. The Black Prince, Edward's 16-year-old son, won his spurs in the carnage, fighting with a valor that became legendary. As night fell, the field was littered with the dead, counts, dukes, and thousands of common soldiers. The myth of French invincibility had been shattered, and the military balance of power in Europe shifted fundamentally. Following Crécy, Edward laid siege to Calais. For 11 months the port held out, its citizens reduced to eating rats and leather before finally surrendering. The king's demand for 6 burghers to present themselves with ropes around their necks, ready to die for their city's defiance, became one of the enduring images of the war's merciless nature. Only the intervention of Queen Philippa saved them from execution, a rare moment of mercy in a conflict notably short of it. While Edward campaigned in France, the shadow of the Black Death fell across Europe. Beginning in 1347, the plague swept through populations already weakened by war and famine. Whole villages vanished, their fields returning to wilderness. The labor force shrank dramatically, giving surviving peasants unprecedented leverage to demand better terms from their lords. The social hierarchy, once seemingly as fixed as the stars, began to tremble. In both England and France, the authorities responded with laws attempting to freeze wages and maintain the old order, but the genie of social change could not be forced back into its bottle. The war continued intermittently, periods of active campaigning alternating with truces strained by continued raiding and diplomatic maneuvering. In 1356, the Black Prince, now a seasoned commander, launched another chevauchée from Gascony. Near Poitiers, he found himself cornered by the army of King John II of France. Outnumbered and short of supplies, the English prepared for battle on ground thick with vineyards and hedges that disrupted cavalry charges. Once again, English discipline and the longbow proved decisive. The French dismounted their men-at-arms to assault the English position on foot, but became bogged down in the difficult terrain. A counterattack captured King John himself, dealing another devastating blow to French morale and leadership. The ransom demanded for John's release was astronomical: 3 million gold crowns, twice the annual revenue of the French crown. To raise this sum, taxes crushed the already suffering population, while the absence of their captured king plunged France into political chaos. In the power vacuum, the Estates General attempted to assert control, led by Etienne Marcel, the provost of Paris. Peasant frustrations exploded in the Jacquerie of 1358, a bloody uprising that saw nobles slaughtered and chateaux burned before being suppressed with equal brutality. France seemed on the verge of disintegration, caught between external invasion and internal collapse. Edward attempted to capitalize on this weakness with the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which granted him extensive territories in southwestern France, in return for renouncing his claim to the French crown. For a few years an uneasy peace descended, but it was built on unstable foundations. The clang of steel echoed through the narrow, winding streets of York as the sun began its slow descent behind the towering minster. In the year 1069, the air was thick with the scent of fear and wood smoke, a palpable tension that clung to the very stones of the city. William the Conqueror, his face a mask of grim determination beneath his nasal helm, watched from a hastily erected command post near the old Roman walls. His mailed fist clenched around the hilt of his sword, the leather of his glove creaking with the pressure. Below, his Norman knights, a brotherhood of hardened warriors forged in the crucible of continental warfare, moved with a terrifying, disciplined purpose. They were not merely soldiers, they were instruments of a king's wrath, a calculated terror made flesh and iron. The harrying of the North was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a systematic, brutal act of policy, a scorched earth campaign designed to shatter not just armies, but the very will of a people to resist. The rebellion that had flared across Yorkshire and Northumbria, a defiant last stand of the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, allied with Danish raiders who saw blood in the water, had been militarily crushed at the Battle of Stafford weeks before. But William, a master of realpolitik long before the term existed, understood that victory on a field meant little if the land itself remained hostile. The North was a vast, brooding entity, its people fiercely independent, its landscapes isolating. To leave it simmering with resentment was to invite perpetual insurrection at his back, while he looked to secure his southern holdings and his borders with Wales and Scotland. And so, the harrying began. It was a campaign of utter desolation, executed with a chilling efficiency that would sear itself into the collective memory of England for generations. William divided his forces into smaller, mobile contingents, each tasked with a specific region. Their orders were simple, unequivocal, and monstrous. Burn everything. Crops still standing in the fields were put to the torch, their golden promise turning to blackened ash that fell like a bitter snow. Granaries, the lifeblood of any community through the winter months, were broken open and their precious contents scattered and burned. Villages, from the smallest cluster of wattle and daub huts to larger settlements, were systematically put to the flame. The thatched roofs caught with a hungry roar, sending great plumes of oily black smoke into the autumn sky, a beacon of despair visible for miles.